Good evening. I'm going to change it up because I don't like standing up there when all of you are back there. I will do my best to stay within the allotted time tonight because Shark Week starts tonight, which might be the best week of the whole year. I'm going to tell you what I should have probably told you this morning, but I was afraid you wouldn't come back. That is that my lesson this morning is part of a larger series of lessons that I did several years ago and compiled called 52 Days Rebuilding Our Spiritual Walls. And so tonight I'm totally cheating because I'm just going to the next lesson in that series that I did. And so if you get tired of hearing the phrase spiritual walls, I'm really sorry. But it's going to happen again tonight. And so if you have your Bibles, we will be in the book of Nehemiah, primarily chapter 1. You know, I like to be comfortable. I think you probably do too, and there's nothing wrong with being comfortable, right? I don't know if you guys experienced any power outages this weekend. We were without power for about 12, 13 hours, and honestly, it was okay, except for the air conditioning went out, right? You really want to know how true you are to a 21st century person? Take the air conditioning away, and you'll see people get grumpy real fast. And it was uncomfortable. That's why I like things like Snuggies. You ever put a Snuggie on, those little blankets with the sleeves, like hugging a panda? It's the greatest thing that's ever been in existence. That's why I don't like things like wicker furniture, because it's uncomfortable to sit in. I don't want to do it. This quarter, I am teaching the middle school class, right? And I will be the first to tell you, I am uncomfortable with that situation because I don't know if I connect with them or not. We do a lot of things that in the name of comfort. We have certain things, qualities of life that we look for, hotels that we will and won't stay in. We have mattresses and shoes and things that we live for and the standards that we look for in being comfortable. And given the choice between being comfortable and being uncomfortable, we will always choose being comfortable. When we first meet Nehemiah in chapter 1, what we find out about him is that he is in the high position of being cupbearer to the king. Nehemiah lived in a palace. I've never lived in a palace. I don't think I will ever live in a palace, but I imagine if you were going to live in the days of Nehemiah, a palace is probably where you would want to live. And there he was, as cupbearer to the king. He is content. He has a great job. He is well respected, he's well fed, he's well connected, and he has a great place to live. By all standards, Nehemiah is comfortable. And you know, as I read the Bible, what I've discovered over the years is that God is not particularly concerned with my level of comfort. In fact, he asked me to do some things that frankly make me very uncomfortable to think about. And in rebuilding our spiritual walls, we have to understand that the process can become something that causes some discomfort, or rather it should cause us to be uncomfortable from time to time. And I don't mean to suggest to you that in this journey of building up our spiritual walls that it's not a joyful or a happy journey. What I'm suggesting to you is that I need you to know that if you take on the journey of rebuilding spiritual walls, it's going to mean that you have to step out of your comfort zone and do some things that God asks you to do, and that's probably going to put you in a place where you haven't done things like this before. And that's okay, because Christianity has never been about being comfortable. In fact, when we get comfortable in our Christianity, that's when we have to really watch ourselves, because you were never meant to be stagnant. You were meant to grow. And that's part of the things that we're going to talk about in this lesson. When Nehemiah decided to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, he made a choice. That he was going to not live in the comfy palace that he had. He made a choice to go from something that was comfortable to something that was uncomfortable, something that was known to something that was unknown. And it was not an easy choice to make. And the same is true for you. You have to choose to be uncomfortable, doing things like praying for your enemies, feeding those who are in need, challenging those who teach false doctrine, putting God first in the kingdom, and being ridiculed for following Christ. Or how about not worrying? Those things make us uneasy. They're hard to do. They're really easy to get up here and talk about. They're super hard to do. Nehemiah chose to leave the comforts of his palace when he learned the shape of a nation that he loved. He chose to give up some of the comforts of his life in order to be more committed to God. And one of the things that makes us most uncomfortable in this life is remembering our past. And most of us, we try to move on and forget it, and rightfully so. This is a good thing. But no matter what, here's what you have to know about your past, is that no matter what's in it, it has shaped who you are today. You're sitting there today because of all the things that you did in the previous days. Who you are right now was determined by what you did and the decisions that you made in the past, and there is value in that. And I love the story of Nehemiah because it's a victory story. It's a glorious, wonderful achievement of what happens when humans let down their selfish desires and submit to the will of God and work together for a single cause. Because in 52 days, Nehemiah leads a group of God's people to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, a task that had not been done in the previous 100 years. But the first question we have to ask is, why were the walls torn down in the first place? What happened? Nehemiah answers this question in a prayer in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 7. Here's what he says. He says, "We have acted very corruptly against you, and we have not kept commandments and the statutes and the rules you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the people.'" The city and the people were ruins, as we discussed this morning, because the Israelites had stepped outside the walls that God had built for them. They disobeyed him, and that part is pretty straightforward. But what most people don't know is that the history of that moment is tragic and it's complicated. It's something that should break our hearts to hear the story of how they went from a glorious, wonderful, chosen people of God to being an absolute desolation. And here's what it says. It goes back hundreds of years before Nehemiah even thought of being in existence, before the walls of Jerusalem were built. God told his people in Deuteronomy chapter 25 in no uncertain terms as a warning what would happen to them if they stepped outside the boundaries that he had set for them. Here's what he says in Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 15. He says, "But if you will not obey the voice of your Lord God, or be careful to do all of his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all of these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed you shall be in the city, and cursed you shall be in the field. And cursed you shall be in your basket and in your kneading bowl. Cursed you shall be in the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground, the increase of your herds and the young of your flock. Cursed you shall be when you come in, and cursed you shall be when you go out." God's rule was very simple. You stay within the boundaries that I've set, and you'll be blessed. If you leave them, there will be curses that come upon you. And that really sounds pretty harsh when you just read that in sort of a generic way. But if you keep reading in the book of Deuteronomy, particularly in verses 49 through 57, God goes into it further. And he looks at them and he says, this is exactly what's going to happen to you if you break my law. Listen, here's what he tells them. Chapter 28, verse 49, he says, "If you break my law, I'm going to send a nation against you that you don't know, and they won't speak the same language as you. And here's what they're going to do when they come in. They will destroy your crops, your livestock, and your food." Verse 52, "They will destroy your town and your walls." And verse 28, or chapter 28, verses 53 through 55, here's what he says. He says that during the siege of Jerusalem, if you get here, if you disobey, they're going to come and they're going to surround your city, and it's going to be so bad. The famine is going to be so great that even you will start to eat your own children. Not only that, but you'll do it in secret so that you don't have to share the food with anybody else. Can you imagine a situation where that would ever come true? And yet, in the New Testament, in 2 Kings chapter 6, when Samaria was under siege from Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, we read that the famine was so great that they started eating donkeys' heads and dove feces. And worse than that, they actually ate another human being because they were so hungry and so desperate. And that siege was far shorter and far less fierce than the one that Jerusalem would eventually endure. And God told them this is what was going to happen. Listen, your past, I hope, does not have cannibalism in it, but it may be just as terrifying. You may have things in your life that when you cringe when you think about your past mistakes. Look, I don't know anybody who's ever lived a life who doesn't have some things in your life that you regret doing. You've got it. I remember that you've been there, don't you? You know that you've got things in your life that you would rather not remember. They're terribly painful, and chances are you've locked them away. And even for some of you, you just pray every day that nobody finds out about what it was that you did on this day. Here's the thing I think you miss. Number one, no matter how bad your past is, there's a future glory waiting for you. Amen. And number two, maybe that journey, maybe those mistakes can help you in your future endeavors and help somebody else. You see, how do we do that? How do we take the history of our lives, the mistakes that we've made, the decisions that we've made, and shape them to become our future? Well, Nehemiah, I think, gives us a good example. It starts with a simple concept. You have to ask questions that hurt. In the case of Nehemiah, it looked like this, chapter 1, verse 2. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped and who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And upon seeing some of his brothers from Jerusalem, he goes up to them and he says, hey, how are the Jews? How's the rebuilding process going? Have you ever thought about the fact that Nehemiah did not have to ask this question? He didn't have to do it. If Nehemiah never inquired about the city, he could have happily lived his life in a palace of bliss as the cupbearer to the king, no wiser to the fact that his city was in any worse for the wear. He could have simply chosen to go about his life unconcerned about the people who were concerned with him. I mean, so far as I know, he didn't live in Jerusalem. He'd never seen the glorious Temple of Solomon. And to the best of my knowledge, he'd never even been to the city. And yet, he asked. And when he asked that question, it became a question that hurt because it changed his accountability to it. Suddenly, he was in the know. Suddenly, he was somebody who couldn't lay his head down at night without knowing that the city of his heritage was in ruins. Asking the question changed his life. We need questions that hurt. And God asks them. He asks questions that cause us to go from oblivious to being informed. You know, most of us, we sometimes don't like to acknowledge things in life. We would rather just kind of move on from them. Have you ever been in traffic and somebody pulls out in front of you and they don't look at you because they don't look at you when they pulled out in front of you? It doesn't count by the fact that they almost hit you. You ever been that? You honk the horn, you yell at them in your car, right? You know, that's some of us from time to time. We just think if we just ignore it, it'll go away. But Nehemiah doesn't do that. We have to ask ourselves, what is our spiritual condition? What does our spiritual wall look like? Is it torn up? Is it burned to the ground? Is it halfway done? Is it a glorious, wonderful fortress? What is it? What do you look like? As you sit here tonight, tell yourself, what's your spiritual condition with God? What does it look like? Is He your refuge and your strength? Or has your wall been torn down? And we have to ask these questions, and they're tough because only we know the answer to them. But sometimes truth is a brutal thing. And it's not just enough to ask these questions. We have to get the truth to be able to tear down the fantasies that we live in. When Emily and I were dating, we were engaged, and I decided in all of my 19-year-old wisdom that I was going to make her a tape. It was a CD, right? When I say this, I don't mean that I was going to get on iTunes and download. No. I decided to get my guitar, which I could not play, and get my voice, which I cannot sing, and I recorded about 6 songs with David and Racina Estep, and I handed it to her proud as I could be. And about 5 years ago, I listened to it, and I thought, why did no one tell me that I sounded like a cat getting run over and then backed up and then run over again? It was awful, right? Nobody ever had the knowledge to go, hey, Ben, maybe you should stick to public speaking or computers or something, because it's terrible. And the truth that we need to hear is one of the reasons now that we sugarcoat things. That's why kids get participation trophies, and you don't fail classes anymore. You just didn't meet the academic expectations of the course. The world is not a better place because we've been less honest with people. What we need is honesty mixed with grace. You see, Nehemiah asked questions that he didn't have to ask. He could have remained blissfully unaware of the status of Jerusalem, but he chose to ask it, and when he asked it, somebody loved him enough to give him an honest answer. Listen to what they say to him in verse 3. They said, listen, the remnant of the providence there who have survived the exiles in great trouble and shame, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Judging by his reaction, this must have been quite the shock to Nehemiah. It broke his heart, and it was the best thing that ever happened to him. He needed to know. He needed a question that hurt, and he needed an answer that hurt as well. And Hananiah and the other men who delivered this message, they didn't have to be honest with him. They could have given him one of those answers that was true, but not really. Something like, well, they're not doing as well as they should have been doing, but we think that they'll bounce right back. But no, because that's not what Nehemiah needed to hear. What Nehemiah needed to hear was that his city was in ruins, and none of those answers would have been beneficial if they hadn't been honest. We need tough answers to tough questions, and God isn't afraid to do either. And they hurt because it's what you need, but that you don't want to hear. And it's tough because only you know the answer to them. And we are really, really good at fooling ourselves. We're really, really good at convincing ourselves in our own mind that everything's fine, nothing's wrong, something's this way when it's actually this way. And we have to be the people who stand up and are honest with ourselves first about the condition of our souls. So stop sugarcoating the truth about your soul. You have to ask questions that hurt. You have to get answers that hurt. And you have to be able to deal with them. I can think of only about 3 times in my life that I have ever wept uncontrollably. The day that my grandmother died, the day that my daughter was born, and watching the movie Marley and Me. Don't act like you didn't cry too. I don't want to hear it. That is the saddest movie that has ever existed. It is a miserable feeling to mourn and weep. And after asking tough questions and getting honest answers, here's what Nehemiah's reaction was in 1 of verse 4. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. Weeping and mourning for days. This is what Nehemiah's reaction to the news that the people in this city he loved was in disrepair. Let that sink in for just a second. Nehemiah didn't know most of these people personally. Yet when he heard the news, he wept and mourned for days. And if Nehemiah had this kind of reactions to bricks and mortars and strangers being broken, what should we do when we're broken or our brothers and sisters are? We need more weeping and mourning in our world today. Amen. No pity parties, no self-loathing, but serious heartbreak over the spiritual condition of our lives. If your walls are broken and you don't feel bad about it, you've got a problem. When we look at the spiritual condition, we should be distraught if it isn't where it's supposed to be. Because you see, we're all broken. Our walls from time to time are torn down, and sin seeps into our lives and sets up camp. And we shouldn't feel bad about it. We should weep and mourn for it because it means that we care. It means our heart has not been hardened beyond repair. When your walls are broken and you no longer weep and mourn, you have a heart that has been calloused over, and a heart that has been taught to stop feeling is the greatest friend of Satan that has ever existed, because it's also a heart that stops caring. And when we stop feeling guilty for stepping outside the walls and the guidelines that God has set, Satan wins and we don't even know it. And perhaps, maybe you're not the weeping type. I get it. Not everybody cries, everybody grieves differently. But folks, if there was ever a time when the church needs broken, honest hearts, it's today. And this part is scary. And it's scary because it makes us vulnerable. It makes us put ourselves out there. It makes me depend on you. And you know what? I'm pretty self-dependent. I don't like to rely on other people. I don't want you to know about my problems. I don't want you to see really what's into my life. But if I can't show you that my walls are broken down in this place, brothers and sisters, then there's no place on the planet that I could do it. And we have to be people who weep and mourn not only for our own lives, but when we see a brother or sister whose walls are broken down, we need to step in and take care of them, because it's our responsibility to do so. We need to weep and to mourn, and this doesn't make us weak, it makes us wise. We need to experience the heartbreak that the Lord God Almighty can offer. But Nehemiah, he doesn't just weep and mourn for days upon end, feeling sorry for himself and for the nation of Israel. He starts in the most powerful place that he knows: prayer. You know, it's super easy to dismiss prayer. We say things like, well, all I can do is pray. Well, folks, that's the most powerful thing that you can do. And here's what Nehemiah says in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 5. Here's his prayer. He says, "And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps the covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandment, let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you this day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted corruptly. We have not kept the commandments and the statutes and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are on the utmost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom have been redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. And, O Lord, let the ear be attentive to the prayer of the servant and to the prayers of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give us success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." And I love this last part, because Nehemiah confidently and directly tells God that he needs a few things to have success in rebuilding the wall. And the one that I find most telling is that he asks, or rather he tells God, to help him succeed. It's a subtle and often overlooked idea, but perhaps we fail most often in our lives because we don't ask God to allow us to succeed. I mean, I've heard prayers about things like, God, help us to succeed if that's what you want, or if it's up to you, and all those kinds of things. But that's not what Nehemiah says. Nehemiah with confidence says, give me success. James in the New Testament said that we are to pray with confidence in chapter 1 and verse 6. And too often we don't receive things because we don't ask for them. We don't pray the way that we are because we're afraid maybe of things that we would say or how we word it. But what Nehemiah and others in the New Testament did, when they prayed with the belief that God was going to answer that prayer. And folks, God still answers prayers. He may say no, but He always answers the prayer. And one of the biggest problems that I see in the 21st century church is that we've kind of neglected the power of it. He understood what it was like to stand before the Lord, the creator of all the universe, in an open avenue and say, God, I know with you we can do this. And his confidence was never shaken. And he blessed Nehemiah. And he'll do the same for us. And when we take a look at our spiritual lives, your past is your past, but also define who you are at this moment. You can use that past to make your history a better history. Nehemiah was fully aware of the haunted past of his people. They certainly weren't proud of what they had become. But Nehemiah used this as a springboard for building better walls. And you can do the same. You see, part of our examining our history, as we talked about, is being honest with ourselves. And if I'm being honest with you, I don't know all of you as well as I would like to. But I know this. People have been people for a long, long time. And you here tonight have walls that are in various stages. And some of you tonight need help. You're here tonight and you're struggling with things in your past. Maybe you're struggling with things right now. Maybe you're here tonight and you're struggling with addiction, marital problems, or money problems. Maybe you're here tonight and you're struggling with feelings that you have that maybe you shouldn't have. Maybe you're struggling with jealousy or envy, or maybe you've got somebody in here tonight who you have a problem with and you two haven't reconciled it together. Maybe you're here tonight and you've been dealing with something in your life that nobody seems to understand. Maybe you're lonely or depressed. Maybe it is that you've got something in your life that you've been holding on to and living on to and afraid that they would get it out there. Listen, folks, I know much about the Richmond Church of Christ, and I know this. This congregation loves people. Amen. And if there's a place to start rebuilding your spiritual walls, it's here. Because here's the most glorious part about the 52-day journey of Nehemiah. It was a success. God did it. He rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days. Imagine what he can do with you. And tonight, if you're here and you're struggling, tonight, if you're here and you're outside the walls of God, tonight, if you are here and you need prayers or strength or a kind word, please come as together we stand and as we sing.